In the vast expanse of the Andromeda Spiral, where 17 different species have built an empire spanning 3,000 star systems, there exists one universal truth that every sentient being accepts without question. Humans are weak, primitive, and utterly unremarkable. They're the newest species to stumble into galactic civilization, barely crawling out of their single solar system with technology so crude it's almost laughable. Their bodies are fragile, their lifespans pathetically short, and their military might so insignificant that most species consider them little more than an amusing curiosity. The Zilithian Empire has ruled the galaxy for over 2 millennia, their queen, Princess Zarathis, being the most powerful being in known space. She commands fleets that could glass entire planets, possesses psychic abilities that can crush minds from star systems away, and has never once encountered a challenge to her absolute authority. In her royal court, surrounded by the mightiest warriors from dozens of species, the very mention of humanity often provokes laughter. But sometimes the universe has a twisted sense of humor. Sometimes the most insignificant grain of sand can topple the mightiest mountain. And sometimes a single human with nothing left to lose can do something that will shake the very foundations of galactic civilization and leave a queen princess questioning everything she thought she knew about power, strength, and the indomitable spirit that burns within the hearts of seemingly ordinary beings. What happens when the weakest species in the galaxy produces someone who simply refuses to stay down? The queen princess is about to find out, and nobody, absolutely nobody, saw this coming. Marcus Chen had been staring at the same dented metal wall for 3 days straight, and the irony wasn't lost on him. Here he was, supposedly representing the pinnacle of human achievement in space, sitting in what amounted to an alien prison cell that was cleaner than most apartments back on Earth. The Zilithian detention facility wasn't designed to torture its occupants. That would have been beneath their refined sensibilities. Instead, it was designed to remind prisoners of their own insignificance through sheer, overwhelming perfection. The walls hummed with energy fields that could vaporize a human in microseconds. The air itself was regulated by technology so advanced that Earth scientists would need another century just to understand the theoretical principles behind it. Even the waste disposal system in his cell was more sophisticated than humanity's most cutting-edge starships. It was a constant, inescapable reminder that humans were playing in a league so far beyond their capabilities that they might as well be insects trying to comprehend quantum physics. Marcus flexed his fingers and felt the familiar sting of the neural inhibitors that had been implanted behind his ears. The tiny devices prevented him from accessing the crude cybernetic enhancements that had been grafted into his nervous system during his years as a combat engineer in Earth's colonial Marine Corps. Not that those enhancements would have made any difference here. His gear had been designed to fight other humans, maybe handle some of the more aggressive wildlife on the frontier colonies. Against Zilithian technology, he might as well have been wielding a pointed stick. The charges against him were, technically speaking, completely accurate. He had infiltrated a restricted Zilithian facility. He had accessed classified information systems. He had caused what the diplomatic corps euphemistically referred to as an incident that had resulted in significant property damage and had embarrassed several high-ranking Zilithian officials. What the charges didn't mention, what the pristine court documents carefully omitted, was that Marcus had done all of this while desperately trying to locate his younger sister. Sarah Chan had been part of a human cultural exchange program. One of those feel-good initiatives designed to convince humanity that they were welcome partners in the galactic community rather than barely tolerated primitives. 23 years old, fresh out of university with degrees in xenobiology and comparative linguistics, she had been selected to spend 6 months studying at a Zilithian research facility. The program was supposed to be an honor, a chance for humanity's best and brightest to learn from species that had mastered interstellar travel while humans were still banging rocks together. 6 weeks into the program, Sarah's communications had stopped, not gradually, not with explanations or apologies, but completely and without warning. One day she was sending enthusiastic messages about Zilithian biotechnology and the incredible advances she was witnessing. And the next day, there was nothing. When Marcus tried to contact the facility through official channels, he was told that his sister had requested privacy to focus on her studies and that further communication would need to wait until the program concluded. Something about that explanation had felt wrong. Sarah was many things: brilliant, curious, sometimes recklessly enthusiastic about her research, but she wasn't the type to cut off contact with family without explanation. She knew that their parents worried, knew that Marcus had pulled strings to get her into the program in the first place. She would have at least sent a brief message, something to let them know she was okay. Marcus had spent 2 months working through official channels, filing requests and requisitions, making polite inquiries through the proper diplomatic protocols. The responses had been uniformly courteous and completely unhelpful. The Zalithian bureaucracy was a masterpiece of elegant obfuscation, capable of saying absolutely nothing while using the most sophisticated and polite language imaginable. Every inquiry was acknowledged, processed, reviewed, and ultimately dismissed with explanations so technically complex that they bordered on meaningless. It was after receiving his 14th official rejection that Marcus had made the decision that landed him in his current predicament. If the proper channels wouldn't help him find Sarah, he would have to create his own channels. Breaking into a Zalithian facility should have been impossible for a human. Their security systems were designed by beings with mental capabilities that far exceeded human norms, implemented using technology that was advanced beyond human comprehension, and monitored by artificial intelligences that could process information at speeds that made human computers look like mechanical calculators. The fact that Marcus had managed to get as far as he did was being attributed by Zalithian security experts to an extraordinarily improbable series of system failures and coincidences. They were wrong, but Marcus wasn't about to correct their assumptions. Let them think it had been luck. Let them believe that human success was always the result of random chance rather than determination, creativity, and the willingness to take risks that more advanced species would consider insanely reckless. That underestimation had gotten him into the facility in the first place. The truth was that Marcus had spent 6 months preparing for his infiltration attempt. He had studied Zalithian psychology, learned their social customs, analyzed their architectural preferences, and identified the behavioral patterns that their security systems were programmed to recognize as threatening. Then he had very carefully done none of those things. Instead of trying to act like a sophisticated infiltrator, he had acted like exactly what he was: a worried human brother who was too stupid to understand how impossible his mission should be. Zalithian security was designed to detect beings who understood the significance of what they were attempting to access. The systems were programmed to identify and intercept individuals who possessed the knowledge and capabilities necessary to pose a genuine threat to sensitive information. What the systems weren't designed to handle was someone who was simultaneously too ignorant to understand the value of what he was seeing and too stubborn to be deterred by obstacles that should have been insurmountable. Marcus had walked through 17 different security checkpoints by simply acting confused and asking for directions. He had accessed classified databases by admitting that he didn't understand the interface and requesting help from automated systems that were programmed to assist authorized users. He had avoided detection by advanced sensor networks by making so much noise and being so obviously present that the systems classified him as a maintenance worker rather than an intruder. The plan had worked perfectly right up until the moment he actually found what he was looking for. The research facility's central database contained detailed records on all human participants in the cultural exchange program, including medical monitoring data that was collected continuously throughout their stay. According to the records, Sarah Chen had been reassigned to a specialized research project 3 weeks into her original program. The project was classified at levels that Marcus didn't understand, but the medical data told a story that made his blood run cold. Something had been done to his sister, something that involved surgical procedures, neurological modifications, and chemical treatments that no human would voluntarily submit to. The medical readings showed brain activity patterns that were completely inconsistent with normal human consciousness. According to the data, Sarah Chen was alive, but whatever was left of her mind had been so fundamentally altered that she might not even remember being human. Marcus had been staring at those medical readouts, trying to process the implications of what he was seeing, when Zalithian security finally caught up with him. Even then, his capture had been almost anticlimactic. No dramatic chase scene, no desperate fighting, no last-minute escape attempts. He had simply sat there, staring at the evidence of what had been done to his sister, until polite Zalithian security officers had arrived to escort him to detention. The trial that followed had been a masterpiece of Zalithian legal procedure. Every aspect of the proceedings had been conducted with meticulous attention to proper protocol and absolute respect for Marcus's rights as a sentient being. He had been provided with legal representation, offered translation services, and given every opportunity to present a defense. The prosecutor had been respectful and professional, focusing strictly on the facts of the case, without any personal attacks or inflammatory rhetoric. The problem was that the facts of the case were indisputable. Marcus had infiltrated a restricted facility, accessed classified information, and violated approximately 47 different interspecies treaties in the process. The court didn't need to consider his motivations or the circumstances that had driven him to such desperate measures. From a legal standpoint, his intentions were irrelevant. He had broken the law, and the consequences were clearly defined. Marcus's attorney, a soft-spoken Zalithian legal expert named Veltar, had done his best to argue for leniency, based on emotional distress and cultural misunderstanding. The judge had listened politely to these arguments and then sentenced Marcus to 15 years in a rehabilitation facility, where he would receive treatment designed to help him understand and accept proper social behavior within galactic civilization. The sentence was, by Zalithian standards, most species who committed similar violations could expect to spend the rest of their natural lives in detention. The court had taken into consideration humanity's primitive understanding of interspecies law and Marcus's obvious mental instability. After all, what rational being would attempt something so obviously hopeless? But sitting in his cell, staring at walls that represented technology beyond human comprehension, Marcus wasn't thinking about the legal niceties of his situation. He was thinking about his sister, somewhere in this vast facility complex, undergoing procedures that were slowly erasing everything that made her human. He was thinking about parents back on Earth who would never know what had really happened to their daughter. He was thinking about a galactic civilization that viewed humanity with such casual contempt that they didn't even bother to ask permission before using humans as experimental subjects. Most of all, he was thinking about the fact that 15 years was a very long time, and that by the time his rehabilitation was complete, there probably wouldn't be enough left of Sarah's mind to save. That was when Marcus Chen, failed infiltrator and convicted criminal, began to formulate a plan that would have been considered absolutely insane by any reasonable standard. But then again, reasonable people didn't typically find themselves in his situation. Reasonable people accepted that some problems were too big to solve, that some enemies were too powerful to fight, that some systems were too entrenched to change. Marcus had never been particularly reasonable. The first step was to understand his environment. The detention facility was designed to hold beings from dozens of different species, each with their own physiological requirements and psychological profiles. The Zalithians had solved this problem through technology that could adapt environmental conditions in real time, creating personalized habitat zones that could accommodate everything from methane-breathing silicate creatures to energy beings that existed as pure consciousness. For humans, this meant that his cell maintained Earth-normal atmospheric conditions, gravity, and lighting cycles. But the technology that made this possible required constant monitoring and adjustment. Somewhere in the facility, there were systems tracking every aspect of his physical and mental state, analyzing his behavior patterns, and making predictive models about his likely responses to various stimuli. The rehabilitation program was built around these predictive models, designed to gradually modify his thought patterns through carefully controlled environmental influences. Marcus began to test the boundaries of these systems. He changed his sleep schedule, altered his exercise routines, and started displaying behavior patterns that didn't match the typical human psychological profile. Nothing dramatic or obvious, just small deviations from expected norms that would require the monitoring systems to recalibrate their predictive models. The beauty of this approach was that the Zalithians expected rehabilitation subjects to display irregular behavior as part of the therapeutic process. Erratic sleep patterns, mood swings, and unpredictable responses were all considered normal symptoms of psychological adjustment. The monitoring systems were designed to accommodate these variations while gradually guiding subjects toward more stable behavioral patterns. What the systems weren't designed to handle was someone who was deliberately introducing chaos into his own psychological profile in order to confuse the predictive algorithms. Marcus spent 3 weeks establishing a baseline of controlled instability that was just within the normal parameters for rehabilitation subjects. Then he began Phase 2 of his plan, learning everything he could about the facility's operational procedures through careful observation and deduction. The detention center operated on what the Zalithians called harmonized efficiency protocols. Every aspect of the facility's operation was designed to minimize wasted resources while maximizing the effectiveness of rehabilitation procedures. This meant that staffing levels, security rotations, and system maintenance schedules all followed predictable patterns based on mathematical optimization models. Marcus began to map these patterns by paying attention to subtle changes in his environment. The timing of meal deliveries, the frequency of security sweeps, the duration of different automated system cycles. All of these provided clues about the facility's operational structure. He tracked the information using a mental notation system he had developed during his military service, a method for storing complex tactical information without relying on external records or devices. The process was slow and required extraordinary patience. Marcus had to gather data points over weeks and months, looking for patterns that might not become apparent until he had accumulated hundreds of individual observations. More challenging still, he had to do all of this while maintaining the facade of a gradually stabilizing rehabilitation subject who was making appropriate progress towards psychological adjustment. But gradually, a picture began to emerge. The detention facility was part of a much larger complex that included multiple research installations, administrative centers, and what appeared to be some kind of specialized medical facility. The movement patterns of staff and automated systems suggested a level of integration between different sections that went far beyond simple administrative efficiency. Most importantly, Marcus began to detect subtle indications that his sister was still alive and still somewhere within the complex. The evidence was circumstantial: unusual energy readings in certain sections, transport schedules that didn't match the facility's normal operational patterns, and medical supply deliveries that seemed excessive for the documented prisoner population. But taken together, these anomalies suggested that the complex was conducting ongoing research projects that required significant resources and specialized equipment. After 4 months of careful observation and analysis, Marcus had developed what he believed was an accurate understanding of the facility's layout, security procedures, and operational schedules. He had also identified several potential vulnerabilities in their systems. Not the kind of sophisticated weaknesses that advanced species might exploit, but the sort of simple, fundamental assumptions that might be vulnerable to someone who is willing to act in completely irrational ways. The problem was that even the best plan in the universe was useless without the means to implement it. Marcus was still locked in a cell that could vaporize him instantly if he attempted to leave without authorization. His neural inhibitors prevented him from accessing any of his cybernetic enhancements. He had no weapons, no tools, no allies, and no way to communicate with anyone outside the facility. What he did have was something that his captors had consistently underestimated: the absolute refusal to accept that his situation was hopeless. Marcus had been trained as a combat engineer, which meant that his military specialty was solving problems that other people considered impossible. Combat engineers were the ones who figured out how to build bridges under enemy fire, how to clear obstacles that blocked strategic objectives, and how to make things work when proper equipment wasn't available. The training emphasized adaptability, resourcefulness, and the kind of creative thinking that could turn everyday objects into tools and weapons. More than that, combat engineers were taught to think in terms of systems and vulnerabilities. Every structure, Every defensive position, every piece of technology had weaknesses that could be exploited by someone who understood the underlying principles and was willing to take calculated risks. The key was learning to see beyond the obvious surface features and identify the fundamental assumptions that made a system functional. The Zolithian detention facility was undoubtedly the most sophisticated prison ever designed, but it was still ultimately just a system created by intelligent beings to solve specific problems. And, like every system, it had assumptions built into its design, assumptions about the capabilities and behavior patterns of the beings it was designed to contain. Marcus spent 2 more weeks refining his understanding of those assumptions and identifying the specific points where they might be most vulnerable to exploitation. Then he began the most dangerous phase of his plan, testing his theories through direct action. The first test was simple but crucial. Marcus needed to determine whether the monitoring systems could accurately predict his behavior when he acted in ways that contradicted basic survival instincts. He accomplished this by deliberately injuring himself. Nothing serious, just minor cuts and bruises that would trigger medical monitoring systems but wouldn't cause permanent damage. The facility's response was exactly what he had expected. Automated medical systems immediately detected his injuries and began treatment procedures designed to promote healing while analyzing his psychological state for signs of self-destructive behavior. The systems concluded that he was experiencing emotional distress related to his rehabilitation process and made appropriate adjustments to his therapeutic program. What the systems didn't recognize was that Marcus's self-injury had been carefully calculated to test their response protocols and response times. The medical intervention had provided him with detailed information about the facility's automated systems, including access codes, security protocols, and the location of critical system nodes that he had not been able to identify through passive observation. Over the following weeks, Marcus conducted a series of increasingly sophisticated tests designed to map the boundaries of the facility's security and monitoring capabilities. He feigned medical emergencies to study emergency response procedures. He displayed symptoms of psychological breakdown to observe how the rehabilitation systems would attempt to modify his behavior. He even staged what appeared to be escape attempts to analyze the security countermeasures that would be deployed against him. Each test provided additional information about the facility's vulnerabilities while reinforcing the impression that he was exactly what he appeared to be, a primitive human who was slowly breaking down under the pressure of his situation. The monitoring systems recorded his erratic behavior and classified it as part of the expected rehabilitation process. His guards began to view him with something approaching pity rather than concern. By the time Marcus was ready to implement his actual escape plan, he had been in detention for 8 months and had established himself as a model example of successful psychological rehabilitation. The facility's records showed steady improvement in his behavioral indicators, with psychological evaluations that suggested he was developing a healthy acceptance of his situation and an appropriate understanding of proper social behavior within galactic civilization. The irony would have been amusing if the stakes hadn't been so high. Marcus's escape plan was built around a simple premise. The facility's security systems were designed to prevent sophisticated attempts at escape or infiltration, but they weren't designed to handle someone who was willing to do things that no rational being would ever consider. The plan required him to act in ways that would seem suicidally reckless to any species advanced enough to build interstellar civilization, which meant that the security systems wouldn't even recognize his actions as attempts at escape until it was too late to stop him. The first phase involved convincing the facility's medical systems that he was experiencing a severe psychological crisis that required immediate intervention. Marcus accomplished this by displaying behavior patterns that mimicked a complete mental breakdown, while carefully avoiding any actions that would result in increased security measures or physical restraint. The medical intervention protocols required that he be transferred to a specialized treatment facility within the complex, which meant that for the first time since his capture, he would be moved outside the detention center's maximum security perimeter. The transport process would involve a brief window of time when he would be in transit between 2 different security zones. relying on automated systems rather than direct supervision. Marcus had studied the transport protocols extensively and identified a 17-second window during the transfer process when the monitoring systems would experience a brief lag while switching between different security networks. 17 seconds wasn't much time, but for someone who had been planning his next actions for 8 months, it would be enough. The day of his transfer arrived exactly as Marcus had predicted. The facility's operational efficiency meant that scheduling was precise to the minute, with no unexpected delays or variations in procedure. Marcus was sedated, according to standard protocols, and loaded onto an automated transport pod that would carry him through the complex's internal transit system to his destination. As the transport pod moved through the facility's corridors, Marcus forced himself to remain perfectly still despite the adrenaline flooding his system. The sedation was real, another assumption the facility had made about human physiology that wasn't quite accurate. Marcus had built up a tolerance to the specific drugs they used through months of careful self-medication, using doses small enough to avoid detection, but large enough to allow his system to develop metabolic resistance. When the transport pod reached the security transition point, Marcus felt the subtle change in electromagnetic fields that indicated the switch between monitoring networks. He counted down the seconds in his mind, waiting for the precise moment when neither system would be actively tracking his location. At exactly 17 seconds, Marcus activated the emergency release mechanism for the transport pod's restraint system. The mechanism was designed to be used only by authorized personnel in genuine medical emergencies, but Marcus had studied the activation codes during his staged medical crises and had memorized the exact sequence of commands required. The restraint system disengaged, and Marcus rolled out of the transport pod and onto the floor of the transit corridor. The pod continued on its programmed route, carrying nothing but empty restraints toward the medical facility. It would take several minutes for the destination facility to realize that their expected patient had not arrived, and several more minutes for them to identify the cause of the problem. By the time security systems realized what had happened, Marcus was already moving through maintenance corridors toward the section of the complex where he believed his sister was being held. The maintenance corridors of the Zalithian complex were a testament to engineering efficiency that bordered on artistry. Every surface was perfectly smooth, every junction precisely calculated, every system component placed with mathematical precision. The corridors were designed to be navigated by automated maintenance drones that could access any point in the facility without interfering with normal operations. What the designers hadn't anticipated was that the same features that made the corridors perfect for drone navigation also made them surprisingly suitable for human infiltration. Marcus moved through the corridors with practiced stealth, using techniques he had learned during military training and refined through months of careful observation. The key was understanding that Zalithian security systems were designed to detect threats as long as he moved in patterns that resembled routine system inspections and avoided triggering any of the automated alarm protocols. The security network would classify his presence as authorized maintenance work. The neural inhibitors behind his ears still prevented him from accessing his cybernetic enhancements, but Marcus had discovered that 8 months of careful observation had taught him more about the facility than any computer enhancement could have provided. He knew the timing of security sweeps, the location of sensor blind spots, and the behavioral patterns of every automated system he was likely to encounter. More importantly, he had learned to think like his captors. Zalithians were logical beings who made decisions based on comprehensive analysis of available information. They assumed that other intelligent species would behave in similarly rational ways, making choices that served their long-term interests and avoiding actions that would result in predictable negative consequences. This assumption was built into every aspect of their security systems, from the algorithms that analyzed behavioral patterns to the response protocols that determined appropriate countermeasures. The problem with this approach was that humans weren't always rational, and Marcus was currently operating well outside the boundaries of rational behavior. He was an escaped prisoner moving through a heavily secured facility with no backup plan and no realistic chance of long-term success. Any logical analysis would conclude that his actions were essentially suicidal, which meant that the security systems weren't programmed to anticipate them. Marcus used this advantage to navigate through 17 different security checkpoints without triggering a single alarm. At each checkpoint, he simply walked through as if he belonged there, maintaining the posture and movement patterns of someone conducting routine maintenance work. The security systems scanned him, analyzed his behavior, and concluded that he was exactly what he appeared to be: a maintenance worker going about his assigned duties. The beauty of the deception was that it didn't require any sophisticated technology or advanced skills. It simply required understanding the assumptions built into the security systems and acting in ways that were consistent with those assumptions. Marcus looked like a maintenance worker because he was wearing maintenance worker clothing that he had acquired during his staged medical emergencies. He moved like a maintenance worker because he had studied the movement patterns of actual maintenance workers through months of careful observation. He acted like someone with authorized access because the security systems were programmed to assume that anyone who didn't trigger alarm protocols must have authorized access. It was elegantly simple, and it worked perfectly right up until the moment Marcus reached the high-security research section where he believed his sister was being held. The research section was different from the rest of the facility in ways that were immediately obvious. The corridors here were wider and more heavily reinforced, with additional security checkpoints that required biometric verification rather than simple behavioral analysis. The walls hummed with energy fields that were more powerful than anything Marcus had encountered in the detention center, and the air itself felt different, charged with electromagnetic fields that made his skin tingle and his teeth ache. More unsettling still were the sounds that emanated from behind the sealed laboratory doors. Not voices exactly, but something that might once have been voices, distorted and altered in ways that suggested profound changes to the neural structures that produced them. Marcus had heard similar sounds before, during his military service on frontier worlds where colonists had been exposed to alien pathogens that affected the nervous system. The sounds were produced by beings whose minds had been fundamentally altered, leaving them capable of vocalization but no longer entirely human in their consciousness. Marcus forced himself to focus on the immediate tactical situation rather than the implications of what he was hearing. The research section's security systems were more sophisticated than anything he had encountered so far, but they were still built around the same fundamental assumptions about rational behavior. The key was identifying the specific vulnerabilities in these more advanced systems and finding ways to exploit them without triggering alarm protocols. The biometric checkpoints represented the most obvious challenge. The sensors were designed to identify authorized personnel through multiple biological markers, including DNA analysis, retinal patterns, and neural activity signatures. There was no way for Marcus to duplicate the biometric profile of an authorized researcher, which meant that conventional infiltration techniques were useless. But Marcus wasn't trying to infiltrate in any conventional sense. He was trying to create enough chaos and confusion to locate his sister and extract her from the facility before security systems could mount an effective response. This meant that he didn't need to maintain his deception indefinitely. He just needed to maintain it long enough to accomplish his immediate objectives. Marcus spent 20 minutes studying the biometric checkpoint systems and identifying their operational protocols. The sensors were designed to process biometric data in real time, comparing incoming readings against a database of authorized personnel. If the readings matched an authorized profile, access was granted automatically. If the readings didn't match, security protocols would be activated, and the subject would be detained for further investigation. The system was essentially foolproof against any attempt at unauthorized access, but it had one significant weakness. It was designed to make instantaneous decisions based on the assumption that every subject would have a complete and consistent biometric profile. Marcus had discovered during his months of observation that the neural inhibitors behind his ears were interfering with certain types of sensor readings. The devices were designed to suppress his cybernetic enhancements, but they also created electromagnetic interference that could confuse biometric scanners if the interference was modulated in specific ways. The technique Marcus had in mind was extraordinarily dangerous and would probably result in permanent damage to his nervous system. The neural inhibitors weren't designed to be overloaded, and forcing them to generate high-intensity electromagnetic pulses would likely cause them to burn out completely. The resulting neural feedback could cause anything from temporary unconsciousness to permanent brain damage. But the technique would also create exactly the kind of sensor confusion that might allow him to slip through a biometric checkpoint before the security systems could analyze what had happened. Marcus positioned himself in front of the checkpoint scanner and began the process of overloading his neural inhibitors. The technique required him to generate specific brainwave patterns that would cause the inhibitors to resonate at frequencies they weren't designed to handle. It was similar to meditation techniques he had learned during military training, but pushed to extremes that were far beyond normal human capabilities. The first phase involved achieving a state of focused concentration that eliminated all distracting thoughts and emotions. Marcus had to become completely focused on the task at hand, shutting out everything else, including the growing pain in his skull as the neural inhibitors began to overheat. The second phase required him to deliberately induce a controlled seizure-like state that would cause his brain to generate electromagnetic pulses at precise frequencies. The pulses had to be timed to coincide with the biometric scanner's data collection cycle, creating a brief window of interference that would confuse the system's pattern recognition algorithms. The third phase was the most dangerous, requiring Marcus to maintain consciousness and motor control while his nervous system was experiencing what amounted to controlled electrical shock. The neural inhibitors were designed to prevent this kind of neural activity, which meant that overriding them would cause intense pain and potentially permanent damage to his brain tissue. Marcus initiated the sequence and immediately felt the neural inhibitors beginning to resonate inside his skull. The pain was unlike anything he had ever experienced, a burning, tearing sensation that seemed to reach into the core of his consciousness. He could feel his vision blurring and his motor control beginning to deteriorate as the electromagnetic interference spread through his nervous system. But the technique worked. The biometric scanners began receiving contradictory readings that didn't match any profile in their database, but also didn't trigger standard security protocols. The system's decision-making algorithms couldn't classify Marcus as either authorized or unauthorized, leaving them in a state of analytical paralysis that lasted for exactly 3.7 seconds. Marcus stumbled through the checkpoint during that brief window, his nervous system still recovering from the neural feedback. The inhibitors behind his ears were completely burned out, leaving him with access to his cybernetic enhancements for the first time in 8 months. But the neural damage from the overload process meant that his enhancements were only partially functional, and using them caused intense pain that threatened to overwhelm his ability to think clearly. Behind him, the biometric checkpoint systems finally resolved their analytical conflict and activated security protocols. Alarms began sounding throughout the research section, and automated security measures began sealing off corridors and activating defensive systems. Marcus had perhaps 5 minutes before security forces arrived in sufficient numbers to make escape impossible. He forced himself to ignore the pain in his skull and began moving through the research section corridors, searching for any indication of where his sister might be held. The laboratory doors were sealed and marked with warning symbols that indicated dangerous research in progress, but most of them showed no signs of recent activity. It was the sounds that led him to the right location. As Marcus moved deeper into the research section, the distorted vocalizations he had heard earlier grew louder and more distinct. They were coming from a laboratory complex at the end of the main corridor, behind doors that were marked with biohazard warnings and sealed with energy fields that made the air shimmer with barely contained power. Marcus approached the laboratory doors and immediately realized that his neural inhibitor overload technique wouldn't work a second time. The security systems here were different, designed to contain dangerous research subjects rather than simply identify authorized personnel. The energy fields were powerful enough to vaporize any unauthorized person who attempted to breach the containment protocols. But the doors also had emergency override systems designed to allow evacuation in case of containment failure. The override controls were protected by quantum encryption and voice recognition protocols that would normally be impossible for an unauthorized person to activate. However, the emergency systems were designed to prioritize life preservation over security concerns, which meant they would respond to genuine crisis situations even if the person requesting access wasn't technically authorized. Marcus activated his partially functional cybernetic enhancements and used them to access the facility's internal communication network. The process was extremely painful, like trying to think through molten metal, but it allowed him to send emergency signals that appeared to originate from within the sealed laboratory. The signals indicated a containment breach in progress, with multiple research subjects showing signs of violent behavior that posed an immediate threat to facility personnel. The emergency override systems responded exactly as designed, automatically opening the laboratory doors to allow evacuation of endangered personnel. Marcus stumbled through the opening doors and found himself in a laboratory that was unlike anything he had ever seen or imagined. The space was vast, with a ceiling that disappeared into darkness, and walls lined with containment units that held subjects from dozens of different species. The air was thick with the smell of chemical preservatives and biological waste, and the lighting cast everything in a sickly green hue that made even the most familiar objects look alien and threatening. But it was the sounds that truly conveyed the horror of what was happening in this place. The containment units held beings that had once been sentient, intelligent creatures from across the galaxy. They had been subjected to experimental procedures that had fundamentally altered their neural structures, leaving them capable of vocalization, but no longer capable of coherent thought or communication. The sounds they made were a constant chorus of confusion and pain, the voices of minds that had been shattered and rebuilt according to alien specifications. Marcus forced himself to focus on his objective and began searching the containment units for any sign of his sister. The process was made more difficult by the fact that many of the research subjects had been so extensively modified that their original species was no longer recognizable. Bodies had been altered, limbs replaced with mechanical components, neural structures rebuilt using technology that was beyond human comprehension. He found Sarah in Containment Unit 47, and the sight of her nearly broke his resolve. His sister had been subjected to extensive neurological modification that had left her barely recognizable as human. Her skull had been opened and fitted with cybernetic implants that glowed with pulsing light, connected to neural interfaces that extended directly into her brain tissue. Her eyes had been replaced with optical sensors that tracked movement with mechanical precision, but showed no sign of human consciousness or recognition. Most disturbing of all were the sounds she was making. Like the other research subjects, Sarah was capable of vocalization, but the sounds that came from her throat were no longer recognizably human speech. The neural modifications had altered the structures that controlled language production, leaving her capable of complex vocalizations that carried emotional content but no linguistic meaning. Marcus approached the containment unit and tried to get Sarah's attention, but her optical sensors showed no sign of recognition. Whatever consciousness remained inside her modified brain, it no longer remembered being human or having a brother who had crossed the galaxy to find her. The containment unit was secured with energy fields similar to those that had sealed the laboratory doors, but Marcus's cybernetic enhancements were still partially functional. With Trust Teddy, he managed to access the containment controls and began the process of deactivating the energy fields, despite the intense pain that using his enhancements caused. The process took several minutes, during which Marcus could hear security forces approaching through the facility corridors. The alarms were growing louder, and the automated defense systems were activating throughout the research section. Marcus had perhaps 2 minutes before the laboratory would be sealed off completely, trapping him inside with the research subjects. When the containment field finally deactivated, Sarah stepped out of the unit with mechanical precision, but no apparent awareness of her surroundings. Marcus tried to communicate with her, but she showed no response to his voice or his attempts to establish eye contact. The neural modifications had left her capable of motor function, but apparently incapable of processing complex information or making independent decisions. Marcus realized that simply removing Sarah from the laboratory wouldn't be sufficient to rescue her. The modifications to her neural structures were so extensive that she would require specialized medical treatment to have any chance of recovery, and that treatment would need to be provided by experts who understood both human neurology and the alien technology that had been used to modify her brain. But even if he couldn't restore her to full humanity, he could at least remove her from this place where she was being used as an experimental subject. And perhaps if he could get her to human space, Earth's scientists might be able to find some way to reverse or at least minimize the damage that had been done to her mind. Marcus took Sarah's hand and began leading her toward the laboratory entrance, moving as quickly as possible while accommodating her mechanical, unresponsive gait. Behind them, the other research subjects continued their chorus of distorted vocalizations, the sounds of minds that had been broken and rebuilt according to specifications that no human could comprehend. As they reached the laboratory doors, Marcus could hear security forces entering the research section. The sounds of boots on metal flooring, the hum of energy weapons being charged, the mechanical voices of tactical coordinators organizing a systematic search of the facility. Within minutes, the laboratory would be surrounded and escape would become impossible. But Marcus had been planning for this moment since the day he first learned what had happened to his sister. He activated the emergency destruction protocols for the research laboratory, using his cybernetic enhancements to send override commands to the facility's safety systems. The destruction protocols were designed to prevent dangerous research materials from falling into unauthorized hands in case of facility breach or evacuation. When activated, they would systematically destroy all research data, sterilize all biological samples, and incinerate any materials that might pose a threat to galactic security. The protocols would also create enough chaos and confusion to provide a brief window of opportunity for escape. As the laboratory's emergency systems began their sterilization sequence, Marcus led Sarah through corridors that were rapidly filling with smoke and emergency lighting. The facility's automated systems were struggling to balance multiple conflicting priorities: containing the research section, evacuating personnel, preventing the spread of potentially dangerous materials, and maintaining security protocols that would prevent unauthorized persons from escaping. The result was a cascade of system failures that created exactly the kind of operational chaos that Marcus had been hoping to exploit. Security forces were being redirected to handle the emergency situation. Automated systems were receiving conflicting commands from different control protocols, and the facility's command structure was breaking down under the pressure of managing multiple simultaneous crises. Marcus and Sarah made their way through the facility toward the main transportation hub, moving through corridors that were rapidly being evacuated by personnel who were more concerned with their own safety than with recapturing an escaped prisoner. The emergency protocols had transformed the facility from a place of rigid control and perfect order into a chaotic environment where normal rules and procedures no longer applied. But as they approached the transportation hub, Marcus realized that they faced one final insurmountable obstacle. The hub was sealed off by security barriers that were powered by the facility's primary energy systems and couldn't be disabled by emergency protocols. Even with the entire facility in chaos, the transportation systems remained under strict security control. There was no way for Marcus and Sarah to reach any of the spacecraft that might carry them away from the facility. They were trapped inside a structure that was simultaneously falling apart and maintaining perfect security around its most critical systems. That was when Marcus heard a sound that changed everything: the distinctive whine of human spacecraft engines approaching the facility at high speed. The sound of human engines was impossible to mistake for anything else. While other species had developed propulsion systems that were more efficient, more powerful, and infinitely more sophisticated, human engines had a distinctive signature that came from their crude but effective design philosophy. They were loud, they produced excessive amounts of waste heat, and they operated with the kind of mechanical vibrations that more advanced species had eliminated from their technology centuries ago. Marcus had heard those engines thousands of times during his military service. But hearing them now, in the heart of an alien research facility that was supposed to be impregnable, was like hearing the voice of home calling across an impossible distance. Someone had come for him. Someone had figured out where he was and had somehow managed to penetrate Zalithian space with enough firepower to assault a maximum security research installation. The implications were staggering. An unauthorized human military operation in Zalithian territory would be considered an act of war by galactic standards. Whoever had organized this rescue operation had committed humanity to a course of action that could result in the complete destruction. The Zalithian Empire had the military capability to sterilize every human world in a matter of weeks, and they would be entirely justified in doing so according to interspecies law. But someone had decided that Marcus Chen and his sister were worth that risk. Through the facility's shattered windows, Marcus could see human attack shuttles conducting strafing runs against the complex's defensive installations. The shuttles were old UEC military surplus, the kind of rugged, over-engineered craft that human forces used when they needed something that could absorb massive amounts of damage and keep fighting. They weren't pretty, they weren't elegant, and they certainly weren't technologically sophisticated by galactic standards, but they were exactly the right tool for assaulting a facility that had been designed to withstand attacks by rational, civilized species. The human attack doctrine was built around the same principle that had guided Marcus's infiltration and escape. Do things that are so obviously suicidal that the enemy won't anticipate them. The shuttles were flying attack patterns that violated every principle of rational tactical behavior, diving through defensive fire that should have destroyed them instantly, and launching assault runs from angles that exposed them to maximum enemy fire. It worked because the Zalithian defensive systems had been programmed to anticipate attacks by species that valued the preservation of their own forces. The defense algorithms calculated optimal firing solutions based on the assumption that attacking craft would take evasive action to minimize their exposure to defensive fire. When the human shuttles ignored these assumptions and flew directly into the heaviest defensive fire, the targeting systems couldn't adapt quickly enough to engage effectively. Marcus watched through a shattered window as one of the human shuttles crashed directly into the facility's primary shield generator, destroying both the shuttle and the generator in a massive explosion that sent debris raining down across the complex. The crash had been deliberate. Marcus could see that the pilot had maintained control of the craft right up until impact, making course corrections to ensure maximum damage to the target. The pilot had sacrificed himself and his crew to eliminate a strategic target, and he had done it with the kind of casual disregard for his own survival that would have been considered insane by any rational military standard. But the sacrifice had accomplished its objective. With the primary shield generator destroyed, the facility's defensive perimeter was compromised and vulnerable to ground assault. More human shuttles were landing in the complex's central courtyard, disgorging troops who immediately began advancing toward the main facility structures. Marcus could see them through the smoke and debris, human soldiers wearing powered armor that looked primitive compared to Zalithian technology, but was perfectly adequate for the task at hand. The soldiers moved with the kind of aggressive confidence that came from knowing that their mission was essentially suicidal, but being committed to accomplishing their objectives regardless of the cost. They advanced under heavy fire from automated defensive systems, taking casualties that would have forced any rational force to retreat, but continuing to push forward with stubborn determination. Marcus realized that he needed to make contact with the rescue force before they could locate him. The facility was vast, and the soldiers wouldn't know where to look for him and Sarah. Worse, the ongoing emergency situation meant that the facility's internal communication systems were either damaged or overwhelmed, making it nearly impossible for him to coordinate with the rescue team. But his partially functional cybernetic enhancements were still connected to the facility's data networks, and he could use them to access communication channels that might be monitored by the human forces. The process would be extremely painful and would probably cause permanent damage to his nervous system, but it would allow him to transmit location data and situation updates to the rescue team. Marcus activated his enhancements and immediately felt the familiar sensation of molten metal flowing through his brain. The neural feedback from his burned-out inhibitors made the pain almost unbearable. but he forced himself to maintain focus while accessing the communication network. The human rescue team was using military communication protocols that Marcus recognized from his own service record. He transmitted his location and status using standard military codes, along with information about Sarah's condition and the security obstacles they would face while attempting to extract from the facility. The response came back within seconds, transmitted in the terse professional style of Special Operations Forces. Acknowledged. ETA to your position, 7 minutes. Prepare for immediate extraction. Warning. Facility will be sterilized following extraction. Move to designated extraction point soonest. The final part of the message hit Marcus like a physical blow. The human forces weren't just conducting a rescue operation. They were planning to completely destroy the research facility and everything in it. The sterilization would eliminate all evidence of the illegal experiments that had been conducted here, but it would also kill every research subject who was still trapped in the facility's laboratories. Marcus looked around at the laboratory complex that surrounded them, thinking about the dozens of beings from various species who were trapped in containment units throughout the research section. They had all been subjected to the same kind of neural modification that had been inflicted on Sarah, leaving them as experimental subjects in research programs that violated every principle of civilized behavior. The beings in the containment units were no longer capable of coherent thought or independent action, but they were still alive, and they were still sentient in some fundamental sense. Destroying the facility would be an act of mercy from one perspective. It would end their suffering and prevent them from being subjected to further experimentation. But it would also be an act of mass murder, regardless of the humanitarian justifications. Marcus found himself facing a moral choice that had no good solutions. He could focus on extracting himself and Sarah, leaving the other research subjects to die when the facility was destroyed. Or he could attempt to rescue as many of them as possible, knowing that doing so would delay the extraction and probably result in his own death when the facility's destruction commenced. The rational choice was obvious. Sarah was his sister, and his primary responsibility was to her safety. The other research subjects were strangers from species he didn't even recognize, and attempting to rescue them would be an act of altruism that would accomplish nothing except getting more people killed. But Marcus had never been particularly rational, and the sight of Sarah's mechanical, unresponsive behavior had reminded him of what it meant to lose one's essential humanity. The beings in the containment units had been stripped of their consciousness and identity just as thoroughly as Sarah had been. They deserved better than to die forgotten in the collapse of the facility that had destroyed them. Marcus made his decision with the same stubborn refusal to accept impossible situations that had brought him this far. He was going to attempt to rescue as many research subjects as possible, even if it meant sacrificing his own chance of survival. Sarah showed no reaction when Marcus explained what he was planning to do. Her optical sensors tracked his movement with mechanical precision, but her modified brain showed no signs of understanding or emotional response. She would follow his lead with the same mechanical obedience she had shown since being removed from her containment unit, but she was incapable of participating in complex decision-making or understanding the implications of their actions. Marcus began the process of systematically opening every containment unit in the laboratory complex. The process was slow and painful, requiring him to use his damaged cybernetic enhancements to access each unit's control systems individually. Each use of his enhancements caused intense neural feedback that left him temporarily disoriented and nauseous, but he forced himself to continue working through the pain. The research subjects who emerged from the containment units showed the same mechanical behavior patterns as Sarah. They were capable of basic motor functions and would follow simple verbal commands, but they showed no signs of independent thought or emotional response. Marcus began organizing them into a group that could be moved together, using simple verbal commands and hand gestures to guide their movement. The process of organizing 43 research subjects from various species was like trying to herd cats. If cats had been subjected to extensive neural modification and stripped of most of their survival instincts, Each species had different physiological requirements and behavioral patterns, and the neural modifications had affected them in different ways depending on their original brain structures. Some of the subjects moved with Sarah's mechanical precision, following commands with robotic obedience but showing no initiative or problem-solving ability. Others seemed to be trapped in repetitive behavioral loops, constantly performing the same simple actions regardless of changing circumstances. Dedicated appeared to be completely catatonic, requiring physical guidance to move at all. Marcus was still working to organize the group when human soldiers breached the laboratory complex. They moved with professional efficiency, sweeping through the corridors with weapons ready and tactical gear that had been optimized for urban combat operations. When they found Marcus, their reaction was exactly what he would have expected from special operations troops, faced with a situation that didn't match their mission parameters. The team leader, a compact woman whose powered armor bore the insignia of Earth Defense Force Special Operations, took in the situation with a single glance and immediately began calculating tactical alternatives. "Sir, we are here to extract you and one other individual. We are not equipped for mass casualty evacuation, and our extraction window is limited." Marcus understood the military realities of the situation. The rescue team had been sent to extract 2 people, not 45. Their extraction plan, their transportation capacity, and their tactical timeline had all been calculated based on moving 2 individuals quickly and efficiently out of a hostile environment. Attempting to extract 45 research subjects would require resources they didn't have and time they couldn't spare. But Marcus also understood that leaving the research subjects behind would mean abandoning beings who had been victimized by the same illegal experimentation that had destroyed his sister's mind. They deserved a chance at life, even if that life would be forever changed by what had been done to them. "These are victims of illegal experimentation," Marcus said, gesturing toward the group of research subjects he had organized. "They're not combatants, they're not security risks, and they're not capable of making decisions about their own fate. If we leave them here, they'll die when you sterilize the facility." The team leader consulted her tactical display and ran quick calculations about extraction capacity and timeline requirements. "Sir, our transport can accommodate additional passengers, but extraction will take longer and expose us to additional risk. Command authority for mission modification rests with you." Marcus realized that she was giving him the authority to make a decision that would affect the survival of everyone involved. The rescue team would follow his orders, but they would also hold him responsible for the consequences of those orders. If the modified extraction resulted in casualties among the rescue team, those deaths would be on his conscience. But Marcus had been making decisions with life-or-death consequences since he first entered military service, and he had learned to live with the weight of command responsibility. The decision he faced now was morally complex, but it wasn't tactically different from dozens of similar decisions he had made during combat operations. "We extract everyone," Marcus said. "Modify the plan as necessary, but we don't leave anyone behind who can be saved." The team leader nodded and immediately began issuing orders to her squad. The soldiers adapted to the new mission parameters with the kind of professional flexibility that separated elite units from regular forces. They began organizing the research subjects into groups that could be moved efficiently, adapting their standard extraction procedures to accommodate beings who required guidance and support rather than tactical coordination. The modified extraction was a masterpiece of improvised logistics conducted under extreme pressure. The soldiers had to guide 45 research subjects through a facility that was actively collapsing while defending against automated security systems that were still attempting to contain the situation. They accomplished this by treating the research subjects as casualties requiring medical evacuation rather than as independent actors capable of tactical movement. Each soldier took responsibility for a small group of research subjects, guiding them through the facility with the same care and attention they would have devoted to wounded comrades. They adapted their movement patterns to accommodate subjects who moved with mechanical precision, subjects who were trapped in repetitive behavioral loops, and subjects who required constant physical guidance. Marcus found himself responsible for Sarah and 3 other research subjects whose neural modifications had left them capable of basic motor functions, but incapable of responding to complex verbal commands. He had to guide them through corridors filled with smoke and debris while avoiding automated defensive systems that were still active despite the facility's overall collapse. The journey to the extraction point took 37 minutes and required the rescue team to fight through 3 separate encounters with facility security forces. The human soldiers handled these encounters with the same aggressive tactics that had characterized their initial assault, advancing through defensive fire with stubborn determination and responding to tactical obstacles with creative solutions that violated conventional military doctrine. When they reached the extraction point, Marcus discovered that the human forces had brought a heavy transport that had been modified for casualty evacuation operations. The craft was essentially a flying medical facility, equipped with life support systems that could accommodate beings from multiple species, and medical equipment that could provide emergency treatment for a variety of physiological conditions. The loading process was conducted with military efficiency, despite the complexity of accommodating 45 individuals who required varying levels of assistance and guidance. The medical personnel aboard the transport quickly assessed each research subject and provided immediate treatment for injuries and physiological problems that had resulted from their extended confinement. As the transport lifted off from the facility, Marcus watched through a porthole as the Zalithian research complex erupted in a series of massive explosions. The human forces had planted charges throughout the facility's critical systems, ensuring that the destruction would be thorough enough to eliminate all evidence of the illegal research programs. The explosions continued for several minutes, creating a pyrotechnic display that was visible from orbit. When the destruction was complete, nothing remained of the research complex except a smoking crater that would eventually be reclaimed by the planet's natural systems. Marcus felt a strange mixture of satisfaction and grief as he watched the facility's destruction. The satisfaction came from knowing that the illegal research programs had been permanently ended, and that no other beings would be subjected to the kind of neural modification that had been inflicted on Sarah and the other research subjects. The grief came from understanding that the destruction had also eliminated any possibility of finding treatments that might reverse or minimize the damage that had been done to the victims. The transport's medical officer, a young man whose uniform indicated recent graduation from military medical school, approached Marcus with a preliminary assessment of the rescued research subjects. "Sir, the neural modifications these individuals have undergone are unlike anything in our medical databases. We can keep them stable during transport, but they're going to require specialized treatment that's beyond our current capabilities." Marcus nodded, having expected this assessment. "What about recovery prospects? Is there any chance that the modifications can be reversed?" The medical officer hesitated before answering. "Sir, without understanding the technology that was used or having access to the research data, it's difficult to make any definitive prognosis. Some of the modifications appear to involve the replacement of organic neural tissue with cybernetic components, which might be reversible with advanced surgical techniques. Others appear to involve fundamental alterations to brain chemistry and structure that might be permanent." Marcus looked across the transport's medical bay at his sister, who was sitting in a restraint chair with the same mechanical posture she had maintained since being removed from her containment unit. Her optical sensors were tracking the movement of medical personnel with mechanical precision, but her expression showed no sign of recognition, emotion, or conscious awareness. "Keep working on it," Marcus said. "These people deserve every chance we can give them." The medical officer nodded and returned to his work, but Marcus could see in his expression the same doubt that was growing in his own mind. The technology that had been used to modify the research subjects was centuries ahead of anything that human science could comprehend, much less reverse. The chances of finding effective treatments were minimal, and the chances of achieving full recovery were essentially non-existent. But Marcus had spent his entire adult life refusing to accept that some problems couldn't be solved, and he wasn't about to start accepting defeat now. Sarah and the other research subjects had been given a chance at life. Even if that life would be forever changed by what had been done to them, it would be up to human science and human determination to find ways to make that life as meaningful and dignified as possible. The transport was approaching the edge of Zilithian space when the communication system activated with an incoming message from an unknown source. The message was transmitted on official diplomatic frequencies and bore the authentication codes of the highest levels of Zilithian government. Marcus was summoned to the transport's communication center to receive the message, which turned out to be a direct communication from Queen Princess Zarathis herself. The transmission was audio only, but the voice that came through the speakers carried an authority and power that made the air itself seem to vibrate with contained energy. "Marcus Chen of Earth," the voice said, speaking in perfect English with an accent that somehow managed to sound both alien and achingly familiar. "You have committed acts that should have resulted in your immediate execution. You have violated our laws, damaged our property, and interfered with research programs that were conducted for the benefit of galactic civilization. By any reasonable standard, you should be considered a criminal and a terrorist." Marcus waited for the continuation that he knew would come. Zilithian communication style always included multiple perspectives and complex qualifications, and he doubted that Queen Princess Zarathis would deviate from that pattern even when delivering what amounted to a declaration of war. "However," the voice continued, "your actions have also demonstrated qualities that we had not previously associated with your species. You have shown persistence in the face of impossible odds, creativity in solving problems that should have been unsolvable, and loyalty to beings who could offer you no benefit in return. Most importantly, you have shown the courage to act according to your convictions, even when those actions carried consequences that any rational being would consider unacceptable." The transmission paused, and Marcus could hear what sounded like consultation with other individuals in the background. When the voice resumed, it carried a different tone, less formal, more personal, and touched with something that might have been curiosity. "I am told by my advisors that humans are a primitive species with limited capabilities and no particular significance in galactic affairs, but your actions suggest otherwise. I find myself intrigued by the possibility that we may have underestimated your species' potential." Another pause. Longer this time, filled with the kind of silence that suggested careful consideration of momentous decisions. "Therefore, I am extending an invitation for you to visit our capital world as my personal guest. This invitation is offered in recognition of your remarkable achievements and in the hope that direct communication between us might lead to a better understanding of your species' true capabilities and intentions." Marcus stared at the communication panel, trying to process the implications of what he had just heard. The Queen Princess of the most powerful empire in the galaxy was inviting him to visit her capital world, not as a prisoner, not as a diplomatic representative, but as a personal guest whose actions had somehow earned her respect and curiosity. The invitation could be a trap, of course. It could be a sophisticated form of psychological manipulation designed to lure him into a situation where he could be captured and studied like the research subjects he had just rescued. But there had been something in the Queen Princess's voice, some quality of genuine interest and respect, that suggested the invitation was exactly what it appeared to be. An offer to establish communication between two beings who had found themselves intrigued by each other despite belonging to species that were supposed to be natural enemies. Marcus activated the communication system's response function and composed his reply with the same careful consideration he would have used for any high-stakes diplomatic communication. "Your Majesty," he said, using the most formal address protocols he could remember from military diplomatic training, "I am honored by your invitation and grateful for your recognition of our actions. However, my primary responsibility is to the individuals who were rescued from your research facility. They require medical treatment that may not be available on your capital world, and I cannot abandon that responsibility for any personal consideration." He paused, weighing his next words carefully before continuing. "If your Majesty is genuinely interested in understanding humanity's capabilities and intentions, I would respectfully suggest that such understanding might be better achieved through actions rather than words. The beings who were rescued from your facility are victims of procedures that violated their fundamental rights as sentient creatures. Providing them with the medical treatment they require would demonstrate that the Zalithian Empire is capable of acknowledging and correcting mistakes, which would create a foundation for genuine communication between our species. Marcus ended the transmission and waited for a response, knowing that he had essentially just lectured the most powerful being in the galaxy on the subject of moral responsibility. It was exactly the kind of behavior that rational diplomatic protocol would consider suicidal, but Marcus had long since given up on being rational. The response came back within minutes, and the tone of the Queen Princess's voice carried what sounded like amusement mixed with genuine surprise. Marcus Chen of Earth, you continue to exceed my expectations. Your response demonstrates both courage and wisdom, qualities that are rare among the beings who typically request audiences with galactic leadership. I accept your conditions and will provide whatever medical resources are necessary to treat the individuals you rescued. In return, I ask only that you honor your commitment to visit our capital world once their treatment has begun. The communication ended with formal diplomatic protocols, but Marcus could hear something in the final words that sounded almost like anticipation. The Queen Princess was looking forward to meeting him, and that anticipation carried implications that Marcus couldn't even begin to analyze. He was going to meet the most powerful being in the galaxy, and somehow, despite every reasonable expectation, she was looking forward to meeting him too. The medical facility that Queen Princess Zarathus provided for treating the rescued research subjects was unlike anything Marcus had ever imagined. Located on a space station that orbited the Zalithian capital world, the facility represented the pinnacle of galactic medical technology, applied with resources that seemed almost infinite. The treatment center was larger than most human cities, staffed by medical experts from dozens of species, and equipped with diagnostic and therapeutic equipment that could analyze and manipulate biological systems at the molecular level. Marcus spent the first week of their stay simply trying to understand the scope of what was being offered. The Zalithian medical team had assigned a different specialist to each of the rescued research subjects, with support staff that included xenobiologists, neural engineers, cybernetic specialists, and rehabilitation experts whose qualifications would have made them legends in human space. The resources being dedicated to treating 45 experimental victims represented an investment that probably exceeded the entire medical budget of the human colonial government. More puzzling still was the attitude of the medical staff toward their patients. Marcus had expected the Zalithians to treat the research subjects as interesting medical cases or scientific curiosities. Instead, they approached each individual with the kind of respectful care typically reserved for honored dignitaries. The medical staff studied the neural modifications with obvious fascination, but they also showed genuine concern for the comfort and dignity of their patients. Dr. Thelvera, the lead neural engineer assigned to Sarah's case, exemplified this approach. She was a tall, elegant being whose species Marcus didn't recognize, with elongated limbs and cranial ridges that suggested adaptation to high-gravity environments. Her manner was professionally competent but also surprisingly gentle as she explained Sarah's condition and the treatment options that might be available. The modifications to your sister's neural structures represent the most sophisticated neural engineering I have ever encountered, Dr. Thelvera explained during their daily consultation meeting. The integration between organic brain tissue and cybernetic components is seamless, with interface protocols that maintain cellular integrity while allowing digital enhancement of cognitive functions. Marcus listened to these explanations with growing frustration. The technical descriptions were fascinating from an academic standpoint, but they didn't address the fundamental question of whether Sarah could ever recover her original personality and consciousness. Doctor, I understand that the technology is impressive, Marcus said during one of these meetings. What I need to know is whether my sister can be restored to who she was before this was done to her. Dr. Thelvera's expression showed the kind of careful consideration that Marcus had learned to associate with Zalithian responses to difficult questions. Mr. Chen, the modifications to your sister's brain are not simply additions to her original neural structure. They represent fundamental alterations to the way her consciousness processes information and experiences reality. The cybernetic components have been integrated into her memory formation systems, her emotional response networks, and her decision-making processes. She paused, consulting data displays that showed three-dimensional models of Sarah's modified brain structure. Removing the cybernetic components would require surgical procedures that would almost certainly result in severe brain damage or death. But leaving them in place means accepting that your sister's consciousness will always be fundamentally different from what it was before the modifications. Marcus stared at the brain scans, trying to comprehend the implications of what he was seeing. The cybernetic components weren't simply attached to Sarah's brain. They were integrated into it at levels that made separation impossible without destroying the organ itself. The modifications had essentially created a new form of consciousness that was neither fully human nor entirely artificial. "Is she still in there?" Marcus asked. "Is any part of the person she used to be still accessible?" Thelvera's response carried a note of professional uncertainty that was somehow reassuring in its honesty. "That is the question we are attempting to answer through our diagnostic procedures. The cybernetic components have not erased your sister's original neural patterns, but they have created new pathways and processing systems that may have effectively isolated those patterns from conscious access." She brought up additional displays showing neural activity patterns that fluctuated in complex rhythms. "We are detecting patterns of electrical activity that correspond to memory formation and emotional response systems that appear to be intact but disconnected from the cybernetic consciousness that currently controls her behavior. It is possible that, with careful therapeutic intervention, we might be able to reestablish connections between these systems." Marcus felt the first genuine hope he had experienced since finding Sarah in the research facility. What kind of intervention? The process would require surgical procedures to modify the interface protocols between the organic and cybernetic components of her brain, Dr. Thelvara explained. "We would essentially be reprogramming the cybernetic systems to allow greater integration with her original neural patterns. The procedures would be extremely risky and might result in permanent cognitive damage, but they offer the possibility of restoring at least partial access to her original personality and memories." Marcus considered the implications carefully. The proposed treatment offered hope, but it also carried risks that could result in losing whatever consciousness Sarah still possessed. The decision would ultimately be his to make, since Sarah's modified consciousness was incapable of providing informed consent for complex medical procedures. "How long would the treatment take?" Marcus asked. "The surgical procedures could be completed within several days," Dr. Thelvara replied. "But the rehabilitation process would require months or possibly years of intensive therapy. Your sister would need to relearn fundamental cognitive and emotional processes while her brain adapted to the modified interface protocols." Marcus nodded, understanding that the treatment would be a long-term commitment that would require him to remain in Zalithian space for an extended period. But the alternative was accepting that Sarah would spend the rest of her life as the mechanical, emotionless being she had become in the research facility. "I authorize the treatment," Marcus said. "When can you begin?" Dr. Thelvara's expression showed what might have been approval mixed with professional concern. "The procedures can begin immediately, but I must emphasize that the risks are substantial. We are attempting to reverse modifications that were designed to be permanent, and we are working with technology that we do not fully understand. There is a significant possibility that the treatment will not succeed." Marcus had been making decisions based on incomplete information and uncertain outcomes since the day he first decided to search for his sister. This decision was no different, except in the sophistication of the medical technology involved. "Doctor, my sister has already lost everything that made her who she was," Marcus said. "The worst-case scenario for your treatment is that she remains exactly as she is now. The best-case scenario is that we get some part of her back. That seems like acceptable odds to me." The surgical procedures began the following day. and required 47 hours of continuous operation by a medical team that included specialists from 8 different species. Marcus spent those hours in a waiting area that had been designed to accommodate the physiological and psychological needs of beings from across the galaxy, but which felt alien and uncomfortable to someone accustomed to human environments. He was joined in his vigil by several of the other families who had come to retrieve rescued research subjects. Most of them were members of species that Marcus didn't recognize, but their behavior patterns were universally familiar. They displayed the same mixture of hope and anxiety that characterized families waiting for news about critically ill relatives, regardless of their physical appearance or cultural background. The waiting process gave Marcus time to reflect on the chain of decisions that had brought him to this point. 8 months earlier, he had been a retired combat engineer, living a quiet life on a frontier colony world. Now he was in the heart of the Zalithian Empire, waiting for news about experimental brain surgery being performed on his sister by the most advanced medical team in the galaxy. The transformation in his circumstances was so complete that it felt like something from a fever dream. But the most surreal aspect of the situation was the invitation that was waiting for him once Sarah's treatment was completed. Queen Princess Zarathis had continued to send periodic communications asking about the progress of the medical treatments and confirming her expectation that Marcus would honor their agreement once the immediate medical crisis was resolved. The communications were formal and diplomatic in tone, but Marcus had begun to detect subtle indications of personal interest that went beyond mere curiosity about human capabilities. The Queen Princess seemed genuinely invested in the outcome of the medical treatments, and her questions about the rescued research subjects showed a level of detailed knowledge that suggested she was personally monitoring their progress. More intriguingly, her communications had begun to include references to Marcus's own background and experiences that could only have come from extensive research into his military service record and personal history. She knew about his combat engineering training, his service on frontier worlds, and even details about his family background that weren't part of any official records. The level of attention that the most powerful being in the galaxy was devoting to a single human combat engineer was unprecedented and suggested motivations that Marcus couldn't begin to understand. But it also indicated that his upcoming meeting with Queen Princess Arathis would be far more significant than a simple diplomatic courtesy. When Dr. Thelvara finally emerged from the surgical suite, her expression carried the kind of cautious optimism that Marcus had learned to associate with qualified success. "The surgical procedures were completed successfully," she announced. "We were able to modify the interface protocols between the organic and cybernetic components of your sister's brain, and initial readings suggest that the modifications are stable." Marcus felt relief flooding through him, but he forced himself to focus on the practical implications of what Dr. Thelvara was telling him. What does that mean for her recovery prospects? The modified interface protocols should allow greater integration between your sister's original neural patterns and the cybernetic systems, Dr. Thelvara explained. "We are already detecting increased activity in brain regions associated with memory formation and emotional response. However, the rehabilitation process will be lengthy and complex.